Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhatia, and welcome to a brand new episode of State of Energy. We are here in Paris for LF Energy Summit, and today we have with us Mike Dolan. You are Senior Vice President and GM of Projects at the Linux Foundation. Mike, we have been talking to each other for a long time, but this is the first time I'm sitting on camera with you. So it's a totally different kind of experience, today. Of course, I've been covering LF Energy for a long time, and I do remember a story where Shuli mentioned how the project got started, where she met you. So I want to just go quickly into the story, how LF Energy came to exist.
Yeah, going back to the beginning tells a lot about where we are today, I think. When you look at LF Energy, it's about taking an ecosystem that is very entrenched in terms of its ways and the processes, and the inertia required to make any change is extremely difficult. And part of that goes back to even how LF Energy started. Shuli Goodman happened to show up at the Linux Foundation office in San Francisco. And fortuitously, I happened to be there along with some of my colleagues, and we were having a meeting there. And this person knocked on the door. First person who I've ever heard of knocking on the Linux Foundation office door. And there's security and all these other barriers to even get into there because it was on the LucasArts campus. And we don't even know how she got there to this day. We don't know. But somehow she got there, and she got through security. And here's Shuli Goodman knocking on the door. Nobody knows who this is. And one of the people answered the door said, hey, Mike, there's somebody here who wants to talk about starting a project with the Linux Foundation. I was like, okay. I was in the middle of a meeting. We were talking about another project. And so here is Shuli. And she immediately says, I have this really big idea about how we can change things that are going on in the energy industry. And I'm really frustrated with how things have been going at the utility and the commission levels in California. And I think open source is the answer and solution to what we need, but it takes bringing people together, and I don't know exactly how to do that, and I hear the Linux Foundation does. I said, that is a lot of what we do. So it makes a lot of sense. Let me bring in a couple people here who are with me. And so we actually sat down at a table, and randomly, without anything being planned, this happened in one day, and it made a lot of sense strategically what she was trying to do. And when something makes sense, and we've got the energy of a person behind it, and Shuli was a bundle of energy. I mean, she just threw everything she had at making a change in this world that would improve the climate, and this was it. And so this was what she wanted to pursue, and she pursued it with a passion. She unrelentingly went out to everybody in the industry, trying to get them to understand the value of open source and why open collaboration could actually help them accelerate what they were trying to achieve. And ultimately, she brought this initial cohort together that started off very small. And today, LF Energy, they talked about, there are now over 70 members. There's 24 projects going right now. There were 0 at the beginning. And we have over 1,500 active contributors in LF Energy projects right now, in terms of developers and engineers working on problems that will, hopefully make the world actually better.
If you look at LF Energy in general, yes, you folks have a lot of projects which are focused on solving a lot of problems for, utilities, or, a lot of, specific to energy sector. But I feel that the role that you folks are going to play is much bigger. So can you talk about the larger picture, that when you look at climate change, or whatever term one wants to use, what role can LF Energy play there?
I think LF Energy can be sort of this diffusion point for disruptive or change technology. And I think that aligns with what Shuli's original vision was, which is, if we keep doing what we're doing today, we're never going to get to where we need to be. And the current system is not set up for that. And there's an amount of inertia that we have to overcome in order to get change driven through the industry. And if we want to meet some of the climate accord objectives and all the different climate initiatives that are out there, doing what we have today and using the current toolbox is not good enough. And we have to come up with a new toolbox. And a lot of what is going to be the future is going to depend on collaboration. It's going to depend on software. How do you build the world's best software? Well, we've figured that out. It's open source. If you look at any code base, roughly 70, 90% of that code base is going to be based on open source. Why would energy be any different? they don't have a lot of developers and engineers like some other industries. So they're already struggling with the fact that there's a very scarce resource in terms of engineers who know how to program and develop systems for energy. So when you're starting at that point, collaboration makes even more sense. You're starting with a scarce development resource. Let's collaborate on things that make sense at a common layer. And I think the idea is that LF Energy can be a little bit more disruptive. It's not tethered to some of the constraints of the past. When you look at the opportunities with microgrids, with renewable energy sources, with batteries, with electrification of vehicles, and the whole supply chain of energy, you're looking at things that need to be connected. And when you connect things in the modern world today, you're generally talking about connecting them through software. And again, when you talk about software, you're generally talking about building it with a base of open source that can be collaboratively built and then reused and help everybody in the world.
Open source, I feel I may be wrong. It's not about code, actually, it's about collaboration, bringing people together. And with Linux Foundation, it's like an umbrella of umbrellas. And so much cross-pollination, so many things happening, a lot of projects leverage from each other. And a lot of players in the energy sector, they will never talk to each other but you folks are bringing them together. So can you also talk about, when we talk about 70 members, that how diverse is this community of LF Energy today?
It's pretty diverse now in terms of, the software stack and the architectures and the parts of the stack that they're all working on. They're working on very different systems. You have, sort of modeling and system simulation. You've got software that's being worked on for edge use cases, edge of network, and everything in between in terms of, the core grid and management and cooperative messaging between different system elements. And so this stack of what LF Energy has been focused on building, it has expanded greatly in the last few years. I will say the collaboration is the key, right? Because not everything needs to be built new. As you know, in open source, a common element is reusable components, and it doesn't, stop at energy. When one of the projects in LF Energy is Fledge Power, which is actually a spinoff of another project in LF Edge. And so what they did is they noticed that, hey, this LF Edge project has the capabilities of what we need, but we need to add in, components that would handle some of the communications required for energy systems. And so they, not hard forked, but they keep tracking to the upstream project, but they've built a version of that called Fledge Power that is actually based on software that came out of the telecommunications industry. So what they're doing is they're learning about software elements that are even outside of the energy industry, incorporating those best elements into the energy system. And I mean, what better demonstration of the power of open source is there when you can literally just pull components in off the shelf from other open source projects and get 80% of where you need to be, add an additional 20%, and off you go.
Yeah, that was a great example. I talked to them. Yeah, so a lot of projects that's happening there.
Speed is another element of why people choose open source. Being able to put this software together and have it ready to go in a year is unheard of in terms of energy projects.
If you look at energy sector, it's going through its own digital transformation at this point. It's not just so also talk about how is LF Energy kind of enabling them, because once again, this industry is not like other industry. There are sometimes only one dominant player in the space, and there is so much code to be written. As I remember Jim Zemlin, a couple of years, he said there's so much code to be written that you cannot write it yourself. You have to lean at open source. So also talk about how you folks are helping these companies with their own digital transformation.
I think, the challenge is there's digital transformations at many levels going on. Within any energy system provider, transmission system operator, distribution system, you have their own internal digital transformation going on, and where they're trying to change some of the ways they've been doing things to more of a digital interface. And so they're going through that. But the energy system is a connected system. You have TSOs, DSOs, all kinds of microgrids and things now. And you have to figure out how to connect these things. And so I think part of what we do is we provide a forum for them to come and talk to each other. You mentioned it before. They don't naturally have a forum to do that today. And open source has been that one place where they can now come together, have these conversations out in the open, and say, here's one of our challenges of our transformation. Is anybody else facing the same issue? And then all the hands go up, and then everybody says, well, who wants to work on this together? And maybe a few hands drop, but there's enough hands there to get something done. And I think that's the power of having this forum available and being able to convene people to have these conversations.
When we look at LF Energy, it looks like kind of European centric, but if you look at Linux Foundation, you folks are solving, global level problem. So talk about the scope of LF Energy. Will it just go beyond Europe? Because energy is not a problem specific to Europe, it's a global challenge today. So talk about the scope of the project beyond Europe.
In any industry where we've had open source like a part of the transformation story, so even when we look at like telecommunications or automotive, there's always some group that sees it first and has the power to move faster. And they generally tend to set the pace and the tone for the rest of the industry. So in automotive, for example, in car infotainment systems moving to open source, I would have to credit Toyota with moving a large part of the industry in that direction. They were an early mover. They saw the future, and they were not afraid to invest in open source to get there. There's often, a lot of challenges, intellectual property being one of them. I happen to also be a lawyer, and I do their legal programs as well. So I get involved in many of those conversations. In the energy sector, for example, there were many questions early on about export controls and whether any company was allowed to put an energy system software stack on GitHub publicly is a conversation we have to go through with many lawyers, it seemed. And often it's about education. It's about educating them about how this actually works so they better understand it, so that they can get comfortable that the risk they may have anticipated or thought might be there is maybe not there. And so that is a big part of what we do is education. It is about educating leaders. It's about education on the business side, but also on the legal side and some of the other elements as well in terms of engineering, because how you start to structure your plans for your internal software stack when you're suddenly dependent on this stream of software that's coming from outside is a very different model from an engineering perspective as well. So part of what we do is try to get them comfortable with this so that their transformation story, is easier for them to tell internally as well, because they have to go and evangelize this. And so each industry that we've worked with has had somebody at that forefront. And so I think the U.S. tech sector is very much, a common show of force in open source, and they show up to a lot of the horizontal technology layers. They're some of the first. When we look at energy or we look at telecommunications, a number of those initial participants started off in Europe. And so where it starts isn't where it ends. If you look at Linux Foundation networking or automotive grade Linux is now a worldwide collaboration. We have the support of many European automakers and US and Japan and elsewhere in Korea. And so it's been a very large diversification globally. When you look at LF Energy, it started in Europe. RTE, Oleander, some of the early participants have been, very much visionaries in terms of what needs to be done. But they're also under a lot of pressure, which has pushed them to make these investments, to be out there up front, because in order to meet the decarbonization goals and the other commitments that they've made to their constituent audiences, they need to move fast. They can't sit around and wait 10 years to see if something comes along. They need to have a solution. And so they are making those investments, but everybody else is watching this. They're seeing it. And when they realize, hey, I need, a similar type of control system, or I need a similar type of edge solution, or I need a similar type of simulation and modeling solution, there's this one out there, and it's already used in production by grid providers, transmission system operators, people around the world. You say, all right, maybe I'll start there. What can I, build off of from that? And that's where I think the globalization and the diversification of the community comes from, in terms of bringing in other participants from around the world and being able to build on something.
Talk a bit about the role that you see of public sector and what kind of involvement you have, because that education is also very important to make decisions policy-based decision that can also help with the open source adoption?
I will say it's great to see regulators and governments, paying attention to open source finally. It's definitely something that can benefit them. It can benefit their constituents and their audiences. They're, responsible to citizens for delivering certain types of, infrastructure, innovation, things like that on their agenda. And open source is a great accelerant to many of those initiatives like it is to private industry. I think part of the challenge is, when governments get involved and they get involved somewhat at a high level and they don't understand the details of how open source actually works. And that's where some of the devil is in the details. And if they don't understand that, you get some regulation that may mismatch what is actually going on in the industry and what the practices are. So we've had a number of governments try to learn, and we've helped provide education in terms of how open source works, what types of security practices are helpful. You mentioned the CRA in Europe. In the US, for example, the Biden executive order that initiated SBOMs throughout the US government was one where they studied for years between NIST, CISA, and all of the other agencies in the United States, FDA as well. They had key stakeholders who went in and really understood SBOMs. They understood how open source works, and they made that investment. And the result of that investment in education and learning has been that they know how to map the right types of policies to keep open source vibrant and thriving in terms of this great sort of commons where innovation can happen. But understanding that the regulation of security, for example, happens at the implementation layer. How you configure software at the implementation really matters in terms of the security footprint. Trying to regulate an open source project community that's decentralized, that has people from all over the world contributing, is not the right way to think about it. And I think that's where we see some challenges too, because some of these regulations like cybersecurity in Europe, the CRA, they have very good intentions. The intention of making sure that products that are delivered to your constituents have at least a baseline level of security is important. But is it the distributor of the product who should be responsible, or is it the open source project community upstream? And I think those are some of the conversations that we're having now and trying to educate people about it. But it's great to have that active engagement. That we're finally having these conversations with governments now understanding how this might actually work.
Right, and most of as you rightly said, the intentions were good, but open source is not that easy. For us it is easy because we have been doing open source forever. But they don't know, and also the intention is good to make sure. But open source, just individual writing a code versus a whole company writing a code, so it's very complicated and difficult. So that kind of engagement and education is also important.
And I think it also goes back to some of our earlier conversation, which is the impetus, the start of some of these things. They're not necessarily corporate approved at start. It's not like it went up to the CEO who said, we're going to go do open source right now. It starts often at an engineering level. Somebody who doesn't have authority to say sign off on a security assurance scorecard for the European Union. And so, being able to keep that sort of organic, community-driven innovation, I think is really important to us, because we know that's what makes open source successful in the long run.
Do you feel that we do need to have regional presence of Linux Foundation, because different countries, they have different approaches, and the fact is that yes, we do need more open source. So what is your long-term strategy and goal there?
I think every region around the world is trying to grapple with how do we, innovate, stay competitive, improve our systems. Every region is going through digital transformation and trying to figure out how to do it. So there's a lot of local collaboration that needs to happen, because there's support systems around these companies that they need to come along with them. And so I don't see an end to regional collaboration. I think that that's always been a thing and always will be. I think certain regions or countries are certainly further ahead and faster. If you look at the United States, for example, technology adoption is a natural part of the economy. But it also drives the economy. So people recognize the value of that, and the investments and the regulations and everything support that. You don't necessarily have the same ability to do that, for example, in the European Union, where you have all these different sovereign nations who have to figure out, a framework under which they can work together and a set of directives that they can work under. And so you have this collaboration across country borders that is unique to Europe. And so Linux Foundation Europe was born out of that need, that there's a need to collaborate amongst different countries on a set of framework initiatives that they do. And whether it be APIs for the telecommunications industry or data schemas or LF energy type projects or things like that, there's going to be many opportunities where European nations need to collaborate amongst each other. And if they're setting regulations for, telecommunications APIs, for example, for Europe, it's really only relevant to European telcos. And so the operators in Europe need to collaborate on something. We provide a forum for them to do that out in the open, just like we do for anything other open source initiative, but something that's there as a structure and a forum for European organizations to collaborate on European problems. Some of that software may eventually be useful in the United States or in South Korea or in China or Japan. But, for now, we know that it's relevant to Europe and it's useful there. And so a lot of this is born out of an investment of the European companies and governments.
There's one more factor, which is like sometimes, governments, they do have a lot of research or, of course, the geopolitical situation. A lot of resource can be allocated only for within the country, So they are not going to work with the foundation or organization which is based outside, So that also makes a lot of, sense to have a local presence there. So tap into those either resources or funds. So that also plays a very big role in having, foundation like LF Europe.
Yeah, it certainly facilitates things. We had a number of our European members, ask for us to set up something like this in Europe because they do have a different structure where the European Commission, European Union is funding a number of initiatives, and they want to see it land in an entity that's in Europe. And so that's a natural understanding from a government investment. It makes sense to keep, the ability to have a locus there. Linux Foundation Europe does give them that opportunity. We now host a number of projects out of Linux Foundation Europe, and it's been going extremely well. So we're really happy with the collaboration there. I do think that Europe is a bit unique. We don't necessarily need to set up, a similar type of structure in other parts of the world yet. But if there ever was an opportunity where there's this cross-border collaboration, I think we would definitely look at that. But we have a strong presence in Japan. We have a strong presence in China. We have entities and structures and things to support those operations. So I feel pretty good about where we're at right now.
Talk about the work that is going on in generative AI space and what is Linux Foundation doing there?
So generative AI is definitely a buzz phrase of the year. It has taken the world by storm when they see what the capabilities are. Your first experience, everybody who's gone and used ChatGPT or one of these tools for the first time says, wow, this is amazing. But it started somewhere. It started somewhere that wasn't as amazing. I remember some of my first times using some of the betas of some of these tools, and I was, a little bit less than, impressed by sort of, its ability to generate like basic HTML code and things like that. But Copilot and the tools now have progressed significantly from where they started. And I think that's another aspect of what's got everybody's buzz going is how fast these tools improved. And if you continue that curve in a very near term, we're going to have a lot more powerful tools than we even have today. And so the ability to, see where this is going is, I think, driving a lot of the interest in the initiative there. Certainly, we have LFAI and data, which has been working on sort of a full stack and suite of tools that organizations need in order to put artificial intelligence and machine learning into practice in their organization. So anything from tooling, the marketplaces, the generation, the builds, how to link everything together. LFAI and data has a set of projects that can pretty much get anybody off the ground and going. What we are starting to see is LFAI and data is also looking at the generative AI space. And so there will be large language model projects coming. I can't really talk about it all right now, but just suffice to say, our community is talking about open source. I think we've seen even from Google leaks there, validation that open source is a very fast innovation model around large language models. I think what we will ultimately see is the fact that you can have open data sets. Like we've been working for years on community data license agreements and trying to get some of the core legal frameworks down so that people can be comfortable sharing data openly, especially for training AI models. And this is exactly what we envisioned years ago when we started doing that. And so getting some of those base licenses agreements down was important. But we see a vision where you can have open data training sets. And so you can go train off of these open data sets, the whole production pipeline and workflow ready to go. You have tools like PyTorch in there and some of our other projects in the AI space. And then you can have large language models as well. And so when people talk about AI and the risk, they're generally talking about accountability, traceability, some of the issues around provenance. And the fact is we've seen our community start to fill these gaps over the years. And so we have AI tools in LFAI data for doing traceability, accountability, all of the things that are required for responsible use of AI. And so what I think we're starting to see is a pipeline from training sets to the tools, the operational elements, the large language models, all being open. What really matters is how you put that into implementation at the end of the day, how you build it, train it, and the operational pipeline is all right for open source collaboration where, again, back to the conversation around energy, not enough companies have enough AI engineers and experts to do this themselves. So collaborating on it in open makes a lot of sense for them. So they're coming to the table, they're having these conversations now about the large language models. And I don't know that it ends there. I think there's more to this AI story to be coming. And we have reinforcement learning and other things going on that I think are also going to be impactful here in the long run.
AI, generative AI, is not just limited to source code of the program. It's much more than that. So can you quickly touch on when we talk about generative AI or AI in general, what does open source means in that context? It's not just about the source code of the
That's an interesting question. We've actually been working with the Linux Foundation. We have a member legal counsel community of all of our members, the lawyers who are in-house counsel participate in that. We've actually had a recent conversation about this at our legal summit this year. But I think what is open in terms of AI is a new question that needs to be answered. I know Stefano over at Open Source Initiative has been working on this with his community and trying to get some feedback on some of their early conversations. There have been a number of other different attempts at defining what open is for AI. Certainly just calling your organization open, as we've seen, is not always open in the traditional context that we're used to seeing. And so there are some open AI organizations that are maybe a little bit less open than we would expect. But I think it is right for us to decide or to work on a path of what is open. And, we can sit here and work on an open AI, not the company, but an open definition for AI. I think what we're already seeing is that the communities are moving fast and they're moving with a speed that whatever definition you come up with may be out of sync or out of date with what's being going on in the community. And so I think when I look at it, I look at every element of the stack, whether it's the model, the data, the tools you use to build it. Are those openly available? Are they reusable? Are they modifiable? Can you redistribute them? And as long as we can do that in a frictionless way possible, like we do for open source software, I think that's generally where we're heading in terms of what is open for artificial intelligence.
One thing that we are seeing, sometimes because of the evolution of cloud, a lot of companies, they kind of struggle and they resolve by changing their licenses, to for whatever reasons. Open source is always a collaborative model. It's not a business model, depending on who you talk to bring people together. But if you look at a lot of licenses, they were written in an age when you write the code, you put it out, somebody downloads it, installs it themselves. So you have to redistribute or all the licenses depending on whether you're downloading. But now we are not downloading any code. Everything is running in the cloud. So do you also feel that the licensor definition also need to change? Or, we still have to stick to the old, if you look at FSF, they have the 4 freedoms or, GNU GPL, GNU version 3. What do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that is a great question. I think it's one that we've been asked, over the years. And what we have seen is in the context of licensing in open source, we've generally seen a shift towards more permissive licensing over time. That has consequences, both good and bad. I think we've had a number of project communities, for example, where defining what is that project still, when people can modify it, put proprietary components into it, and then say, oh, we're still based on, the project name, has been a challenge. And so a number of our project communities have solved the challenge with some sort of conformance or testing or compatibility suite program in order to solve this from a trademark point of view, not a licensing perspective. And so some of the policing or the good community behavior is driven through trademark programs. That is, of course, trying to deal with the issues that the copyleft licenses inherently solve, which is making that source code available to the users who receive it. And so there's huge benefits to the users in that situation. But it also, may sometimes prevent collaboration from happening at all. And so what you're dealing with is a situation where a lot of organizations have greenlit or are comfortable with permissive licenses. And so you see a lot of permissive licensing going on. Now, when a cloud organization or some other organization fearful of a SaaS provider or a cloud provider, taking their code and making it available at scale, I question whether they should have been using an open source license at all. Going about it that way. But, coming up with proprietary licenses is not generally the right solution in my point of view. Obviously, I'm a bit biased working for the Linux Foundation, but, there are a number of ways to continue to have open source collaboration. And if you really want that type of collaboration, what we've seen with a lot of the relicensing is that those are driven by single company projects where one company already has control. One company's making all the engineering investment. And again, did they really need that to be open source at the beginning at all? Or was that a way to get a freeware type model where you distribute it out, then change the license, which then upsets your users and everybody who are dependent on your code base, which causes a whole bunch of friction and maybe benefits your business model in the short run. But ultimately, there's going to be another open source alternative out there that people may switch to as well.
As we're talking about, open source, I also want to talk about the rule organizations like Linux Foundation. There are other organizations also, Apache, they're open, tons of organizations. But you folks have played a very critical role in kind of adoption of open source by creating a neutral, even playing field where folks can put their code base without worrying about that the license will change tomorrow and they'll get locked out. Because otherwise, you will be apprehensive in using a code base of your competitor. So talk about the role that these kind of organizations have played in making open source more popular.
I think you hit it on the head right there. I mean, that is the role that organizations like the Linux Foundation, the Apache Software Foundation, Eclipse International, and others play, is that we give a neutral open space for people to collaborate together, knowing that no one company can then suddenly take it over or change the terms. What we focus on when we stand up new projects is we focus on writing down the governance so people know what the rules of decision making are, so that it's not guesswork or something to figure out later. We write down the intellectual property terms, make sure everybody's operating on the same playing field from an intellectual property perspective, and off you go. I mean, there's really not too much more than that. But, the trademark has to be owned by the foundation. That has been one that is sometimes a sticking point. But you learn a lot in a conversation with a company who wants to contribute a project, but they want to retain control of the trademark. Because what do you need control of that trademark for? There's only certain things that can, benefit or be useful for. And if you're trying to do that, that's not a collaborative, neutral place anymore. When one company has control over how others can use the mark, that's a challenge. What we do is we democratize use of the trademark of the project. So if a project wants to put together a trademark usage policy, they do it as a community, not as one company dictating to everybody else what it needs to be. And that's not for everybody. That's not for every company. And so, some continue to have their own commercially driven open source projects, and that's perfectly fine because all the better if it's open source, right? But certain ones do need that dependency of a neutrality, and we are a great place for that. We're also formed to convene where it's non-competitive. People don't go to the Linux Foundation or the Apache Software Foundation and view us as competitors. We're a neutral place to potentially enable them to collaborate with others, and I think our ability to facilitate that collaboration is what sets us apart.
One more question I want to ask you of of course, this is more or less like a misconception, but I do want to demystify is that, a lot of, big players, just by joining Linux Foundation or getting a seat on the board, they suddenly take control of the whole project. That is not how it works, because you folks have, like, different projects, they have their own governance. The technical steering committees are there. Of course, there is the whole governance model. But just because a company joins, and sits on the board doesn't mean they dictate the project, because project is still being written by the developers. And of course, it's kind of, you can say, democracy or meritocracy. If a company can pump in 100 developers out of 120 developers, of course, but they are dedicating their resources. That means they are putting their efforts into a project that is being used by their competitors as well. So can you demystify this whole thing, that just by, a big company joins and they start control? I want to, because it has been covered a lot, but I want, that, no, this is now how things actually work.
Yeah, that is, I think a favorite talking point of people who are, trying to, create FUD around, foundations and what goes on. The reality is that the companies who are investing in our open source projects are generally investing engineering resources. All decision-making in our projects on the code basis is done by the technical community under a typical duocracy governance model, as we refer to it, meaning that the people doing the work are making the decisions. Nobody who pays any money to the Linux Foundation or any of our sub-projects makes decisions about the technical code bases or the technical artifacts that are being produced. That's all based on showing up, making a contribution, having the merit of that contribution evaluated by a community, reviewed, and accepted. And that is what makes open source works. Our projects are no different. We don't have some magical way to give some companies, the ability to veto or decide something and still have open source works. Otherwise, our projects would fail in a minute. But what these companies do understand is that they're applying a lot of engineering resources. In many cases, these engineers are making very substantial amounts of money. They are paid highly well. And, when you're making that investment, if you have 10 engineers working on Kubernetes at $250,000 or more a year in annual fully loaded cost, well, that's a $2.5 million investment. What is it to give the Linux Foundation $100,000 to, say, help support them with maybe a build release engineer or a documentation writer or marketing support or an event to get these developers that are the R10 together with 1,000 other developers from other companies so that they can decide how the next generation of some API architecture works. So for them, what they view it as their investment in the foundation, and the reason they give the foundation is for resources that make their engineers more productive and more successful in what they're building. And sometimes that's in the form of marketing as well, in terms of getting the word out about the project so that people understand this is a viable option. The industry is behind it. This is low risk in terms of adoption. And so being able to build that sort of marketing momentum around it helps their developers as well, because now everybody's productive and swimming in the same direction. So yes, companies do invest a lot in the Linux Foundation projects, but that's because they're getting a benefit out of it in terms of productivity of their engineers and the success of the project that they want to see adopted more worldwide.
Mike, thank you so much for taking time out to sit down with me and talk about the various aspects of not only open source, but also foundations. Thanks for all those insights. And I would love to chat with you again soon. Thank you.
Sounds good.